This week we're going to be talking about the Cold War and the effects of the Cold War on American society. If we remember from the New Deal, we saw the emergence of what we refer to as the welfare state. So this was a big shift in economic philosophy precipitated by the Great Depression, in which the American government began to explode, and the extension of this was to try to make sure that another Great Depression didn't happen. We saw that some of these programs were very transformative, and a lot of Americans really liked them. There was pushback to others. Some Americans believed that the encroachment of a larger state, even if it was trying to keep economic depression from happening, was not a good idea and could potentially hurt the freedoms of individual Americans. Many other Americans who saw poverty or the inability to have economic stability as the real threat to American liberty gravitated towards the expansion of New Deal programs and the emergence of the welfare state as a positive good. As we continue to move through the 20th century, that expansion of the welfare state, particularly the bulking up of federal programs and the larger federal reach into the individual lives of American citizens, even with its tendency to want to provide economic stability or greater opportunity for more American citizens, will really form the background of some major disagreements that really go all the way back to that Federalist, Anti-Federalist disagreement at the beginning of the nation. Over 100 years later, in the middle of the 20th century, we are living on the other side of the Industrial Revolution. We've seen how the explosion of capitalism can come just as tyrannical as a king or any kind of monarchical government could in previous centuries. We saw how by 1935, the implementation of the Social Security Act had reframed the philosophical underpinnings of the federal government away from that laissez-faire Gilded Age approach, and it essentially said that it was the role of the federal government to at least create a bottom floor that hopefully its citizens would not fall beneath. Historians have often pointed to the fact that New Deal programs didn't end the Great Depression, and whether or not they would have is kind of an open debate. Unfortunately, we'll never know if New Deal programs, without the larger context of international conflict, would have pulled us out and kept us out of the Great Depression. By the mid-30s, the rise of global fascism, specifically with the extension of Nazi Germany, had created a global threat. Although Americans were very reluctant to get engaged in the Second World War, just like they had been the First, the 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor had pulled us into the war, and at that point, we never looked back. With World War II, we really see the culmination of the threat of technological advancement when it's laid on top of geopolitical conflict. What the Second World War showed is that the harnessing of new nuclear and atomic capabilities only made the destruction of warfare exponentially great. During the Second World War, the cost of civilian lives was more than twice the American military casualties during the Civil War. Just a few years after Pearl Harbor was attacked by Japan in December of 1941, we harnessed atomic and nuclear power to attack Japan to begin to end the war. The advisors of President Truman at the time had believed that invading Japan would cost 250,000 American lives and was unadvisable. Others thought that dropping the atomic bomb was morally indefensible, and that the widespread destruction of casualties of non-combatants, of women, children, and people who weren't fighting the war couldn't morally justify such large-scale destruction. World debate over using atomic bombs on other nations, and specifically how it would affect people who are not fighting in the war, civilians, women, and children, is an ongoing ethical debate. In August of 1945, the U.S. dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, killing 70,000 people immediately, radiation killing almost another 70,000 people by the end of that year. 3 days later, we dropped another bomb on Nagasaki, killing another roughly 70,000 people. And that same day, the Soviets invaded Manchuria, and a week later, Japan surrendered. Use of atomic warfare completely changed the face of global international relations. It also radically changed the way in which war was waged. The Second World War almost simultaneously marked the beginning of the Cold War. To understand the economic and cultural significance of the Cold War, we need to understand its origins. So the U.S. emerged from World War II as a global superpower. We went from Great Depression, instituting New Deal, massive government spending. That government spending began to lay the groundwork for the ability to mobilize once the war began to happen. With that infrastructure laid, it got switched over into a war economy, and that influx of income that happened during the war ended up pulling us out of the Great Depression and then setting us up to be an economic, political superpower for decades to come. As we emerged out of World War II, 50% of the world's manufacturing came from the U.S. We had the most powerful Navy, the most powerful Air Force. We were committed in a way we had never been to the international community. We were committed to the UN, the World Bank. We were no longer isolationist. To step into that, we promoted ourselves simultaneously as a promoter of democracy and capitalism. But we weren't the only ones. On the other side of the world, the Soviets also emerged from World War II as a global superpower. Particularly with it playing such a central role in winning the war, the Soviets had begun to claim that communism had taken it from a backward nation to a superpower, and this claim began to bring it really prestige from many of these emerging colonial nations who were trying to become independent in the era after the World War. The Soviets emerged as a superpower as well, but they had suffered heavy losses. Millions and millions of Soviets died during the World War. Although they'd suffered such heavy losses, they wanted to expand. There was a Soviet initiative in order to expand communism throughout the world, but they didn't want to take on America head-to-head, even though they wanted to extend their influence into Eastern Europe and eventually to the world. We had entered the World War under FDR before he died in office, and President Truman had taken the presidency and used the atomic bomb on Japan to help end the war. When we were getting towards the end of the war, FDR had initially believed that the Soviets could be friends with the United States, but he realized that this friendship was born out of a common enemy rather than shared interests, values, or history. The alliance between the United States and the USSR that had helped overturn Nazi Germany and win the war began to fall apart almost as soon as peace was declared. Pretty soon, Soviets began installing pro-communist governments in Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria. You could see that they were beginning to expand, even though at major conferences like Yalta leading up to the end of the war, they had said that they wouldn't expand or try to overtake or topple democratic processes in order to instill communist governments. This looked to be exactly what they were going to do. To make matters worse, Europe was in shambles. So Britain was broke. They couldn't really extend financial or military aid to places like Greece or Turkey, who were really in dire straits. Truman began using this idea of the defense of freedom internationally to get public support together for the extension of American influence throughout the world. As a leader of the free world, Truman would say it's our job to support freedom-loving people here and abroad. He gave a very famous 18-minute speech in which he used the word freedom 24 times, creating this post-war language of freedom and democracy and opposition. What came out of this becomes known as the Truman Doctrine, which was this attempt to pull together a bipartisan appeal to contain communism. He began talking about how this was the guiding spirit of the American foreign policy. This was effective, and he ended up pulling together a bipartisan appeal to contain or curtail communism, and this became what people have referred to as the guiding spirit of American foreign policy for the next half century. Immediately, America began pumping millions and millions of dollars. 100 million just to Greece and Turkey alone. The idea here was that in pumping millions and millions of dollars into European or emerging nations, that creating that economic stability would make these nations more susceptible to Western influence, Western democracy, and it would also keep them from being susceptible to the spread of communism. Under Truman and the Truman Doctrine, the CIA was formed in 1947, and this set this precedent that we were going to help anti-communist regimes, no matter how undemocratic they might be. As long as they were anti-communist, we were willing to pump in intelligence, political support, financial support, in order to prevent the extension of Soviet influence. This ended up setting up a huge network of global military alliances directed against the expansion of the Soviet Union. The CIA in particular was established to weaponize knowledge. It was supposed to gather intelligence and conduct secret military operations abroad. In June 1947, Secretary of State George Marshall introduced what's often referred to as the Marshall Plan. This is kind of an extension of the Truman Doctrine. The idea here is that the European food shortages were building communist sympathies. So again, this is an extension of the Truman Doctrine, the idea that we have to pump tons of money into overseas governments' initiatives in order to create economic stability. But under the Marshall Plan, we pledged millions and millions of economic recovery into Europe in order to keep Soviet influence again at bay. The idea here is that we're going to eradicate poverty, chaos, hunger internationally. This was framed as a new deal for the world, right? Its slogan was, "Prosperity makes you free." Notice the implication here. Capitalism, democracy, all of this is tied into freedom. By 1949, things become very complicated. The Soviets, who had not previously had atomic capabilities, harnessed atomic power, and in 1949 they tested their first atomic bomb. To make matters worse, in 1949, communists led by Mao Zedong won the long Chinese Civil War, and this was seen as a huge setback for containment. All of a sudden, one of the largest countries in the world had just turned red. The Truman administration wouldn't even recognize this emerging communist Chinese government, the People's Republic of China, and they blocked it from having a seat at the UN. It wasn't until the 1970s that the U.S. recognized this exiled government. With the Soviet Union and the United States both having nuclear and atomic capabilities, it was very clear that any kind of hot war where they went head-to-head could potentially lead to global destruction. The outworking was this, is that traditional warfare didn't happen between the United States and Soviet Union. Instead, traditional battles or hot wars happened in what we call proxy wars, where the Soviets would back or support a certain administration and the United States would back or support a certain administration, and those places, those battles, those actual physical combats would happen throughout other nations, especially emerging nations who were either trying to gain independence or who were trying to become a player on the international stage. There were many proxy wars that have happened during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, in the Middle East, in Central and South America, and in Southeast Asia. In 1950, the most well-known one of these is the Korean War. Korea was occupied by Japan during World War II, and it was divided up into two governments in 1945. These two governments had evolved into communist North Korea and anti-communist South Korea. In 1950, North Korea invaded the South. Using Korea as a test case for containment, Truman persuaded the UN Security Council to use force to repel the invasion. This was the first major hot war or proxy war that happened during the Cold War. American-dominated UN forces pushed into North Korea, but hundreds of thousands of Chinese intervened, pushing them back. General MacArthur wanted to invade China and use nuclear weapons again, but Truman resisted that idea. It was eventually settled into a stalemate around the original lines, and there's never been a peace treaty officially ending the war. While we were fighting the Cold War and we were fighting hot wars through other sovereign nations, there was a culture war at home. National security agencies encouraged Hollywood to produce anti-communist movies in order to influence the way the public thought about communism. Examples of this were The Red Menace and I Was Married to a Communist. They urged movie scripts to really shy away or refrain from anything that referred to, say, Indian removal, racial discrimination, lynching, slavery. There was a real push for a revisionist history to cut out anything that would make America look unequal, undemocratic, or unjust. We actually did the opposite. The CIA, the Defense Department, began funneling money and funds into creating things that would make America look more free. A really good example is them pumping a bunch of money into modern artists like Jackson Pollock. Basically, the argument was that such creative and freeform expressions obviously couldn't come from anything like the communist regime. It had to be products of American democratic capitalist creativity. The flip side to this was that anything that looked to be socialism or that could be tied to communism or anything Soviet in any way was deemed anti-freedom, thus anti-American. Anything that looked like socialism, socialized programs, if you think of like during this time there was a push for universal health care, which is still a huge conversation, and it was actually the American Medical Association that began to move back and to discredit Truman, who was beginning to push for national health insurance. So here we can see how the culture war defined and put boundaries around what was seen as American, and even access to things that potentially could have helped millions of Americans were pushed off the table because it looked or it seemed like something that would come from communist or Soviet Russia. This is particularly interesting because there was still a progressive push, a very New Deal push that was beginning to come through the 1940s and that Truman was spearheading. He wanted to continue these New Deal programs. He even talked about what he called the Fair Deal. Remember how we said that during the Progressive era, Teddy Roosevelt had kind of pioneered a new way of thinking about the relationship of the federal government to internal conflicts between business and labor. He had sat down with business leaders and labor leaders during the Progressive era, and he said that it is necessary to come to a square deal where everyone wins. The New Deal had been much of an extension of this, right? It had been an expansion of the federal government in order to extend fairness of opportunity and to put that bottom floor of poverty that American citizens couldn't fall beneath. Truman was very much a New Dealer in the FDR sense, and he wanted to expand those federal government programs. So we have the Square Deal under Roosevelt, we have the New Deal under FDR, and then Truman began to push forward what he called this Fair Deal legislation. Part of this Fair Deal legislation was a higher minimum wage, national health insurance, more public housing, an expansion of Social Security and education. All of this he called the Fair Deal. Republicans would criticize this, and they would say that it was out-New Dealing the New Deal. Republicans and Southern Democrats who continued to dominate Congress began to push back against this, right? Congress began fighting Truman, saying that it wanted to enact tax cuts for the wealthy, reversing a lot of these labor gains that we had seen, and passing right-to-work laws that included making unions swear that they weren't communists. But even the expansion of Truman's Fair Deal hit major roadblocks. There were some significant racial gains that came out of the 1940s. In fall of 1947, Truman appointed a commission on civil rights. This commission ended up producing a report called "To Secure These Rights," and essentially what this did was it was a devastating indictment of American racial inequality, and it called for the federal government to begin instituting programs in order to push back against racial inequality. The shift to civil rights wasn't something that just came out of Truman's Democratic Party. The New Deal had discrimination baked into it. We'd seen how through segregated programs, through the Federal Housing Administration, on a number of ways the New Deal programs had benefited somewhat, but in drastically different measures, black and white America. This was exacerbated in the 40s, specifically as the emergence of federal contracts and jobs began to catapult us out of the Great Depression and make us economically viable on an international stage. We literally went from economic ruin to a superpower. During that process, the road to economic affluence was also disproportionately divvied out to white Americans. During the 40s, the black labor movement, spearheaded by people like J. Philip Randolph and then Bayard Rustin, had pushed back and threatened the administration, basically saying if there wasn't the doing away with discrimination, that there would be large-scale revolt. They even threatened to march on Washington 2 decades before the one that happened in the 60s. Pushed by the threat of organized civil rights dissent, and the threat of America looking very hypocritical on an international stage, in 1948, Truman presented a civil rights program to Congress promoting Civil Rights Commission, a repeal to the poll taxes, laws against lynching, and an action to promote job equality. A Republican and Southern Democrat-controlled Congress came together and rejected it in total. In reaction, in July of 1948, Truman issued an executive order that desegregated the Army. The Korean War would be the first integrated war since the American Revolution. And the desegregation of the Army would predate the desegregation of American schools by almost a decade. By the 1950s, the Cold War was international. In 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was established, and what this did was pull together a large swath of international supporters of pro-Western, pro-democratic, pro-American countries in order to present a unified effort against the expansion of Soviet communism. This was a defensive alliance in which individual countries came together in order to agree to defend another one if one of them was attacked. This set the stage for Cold War alliances, and it was countered in 1955 by the Soviet Warsaw Pact, which was a unified effort of Eastern European socialist countries to push back against the united effort of NATO members. The coming together of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, against the Warsaw Pact would set the stage for the global Cold War for the next half-century.